It was a winter night, heavy with silence, when the world that Mae Coughlin knew began to tremble. For across the distance she heard the echo of sirens winding their way through the streets, and in those wails was carried the sound of finality. It was the night her husband, Alphonse, was taken into the custody of the law, and though the city watched with fevered attention, she remained within her home, a figure unseen, listening as if the wind itself were carrying away the life she had known. Welcome, dear listener. Tell me, as you drift into this story, where do you find yourself tonight, and what hour does your clock whisper? You are part of a circle wider than you know, a gathering of minds across continents and years, each joined by memory and history. If you wish to share this path with us again and to keep alive these quiet journeys into the past, I invite you to lend your support with a gentle touch upon the subscribe, and so walk with me further into the shadows of time. She was born Mary Josephine Coughlin in the year 1897 in Brooklyn, New York, when the streets were still lined with the rough timber of tenements and the air carried the mingled scents of coal smoke, horse sweat, and the sharp salt of the nearby harbor. To imagine her as a child is to picture a slender girl stepping carefully between puddles on a cobblestone street, her boots worn but kept polished by a mother's hand, her hair tied back with a ribbon of faded blue. She came of Irish stock, the daughter of immigrants who had brought with them the faith and habits of an old land, and within their modest rooms, candles were often lit before holy figures whose eyes seemed to watch silently over the family's uncertain fortunes. The world into which she came was neither prosperous nor destitute, but balanced in that fragile middle where survival depended on quiet perseverance. The family kept close to the rituals of the church, and the ringing of the bells on Sundays filled the narrow streets as children in woolen coats hurried behind their elders. One can imagine her small hand slipping into her father's larger one, the leather of his glove rough against her palm as they walked toward Mass under skies that were often gray with smoke. These were the years when Brooklyn's neighborhoods were both harsh and communal, where neighbors leaned from windows to call greetings, where washing lines strung high above the alleys bore witness to the ordinary battles of daily life. Mary grew in this setting, shaped by its caution, its closeness, and its respect for quiet dignity. There are few records of her early schooling, yet one might suppose she sat in a wooden desk carved with the initials of those who came before, ink smudged upon her fingers as she practiced her letters by the light that streamed through narrow windows. If the classroom smelled of chalk and dust, it was also filled with the murmurs of immigrant children learning to make their way in a language that was both theirs and not theirs, a language of possibility and distance. From such beginnings, Mary's manner of silence was born, a silence not of ignorance but of listening, of observing without drawing the eye. She was never a woman meant for spectacle, and even in youth she moved through her world with a gentleness that allowed her to blend into its corners. Yet there is a mystery in this too, for sometimes it is the quiet ones who carry within themselves the deepest reserves of endurance, waiting for the moment when their stillness will serve them in ways unseen. In those early years, the rhythms of life were steady. The clatter of carts upon the stones, the calls of vendors, the tolling of church bells at noon, all framed her days. Within her home, one imagines the sound of her mother's voice humming softly while preparing bread, the warm smell of yeast filling the room, mingled with the faint dampness that always clung to city walls. Mary would have learned the small duties expected of a daughter, mending, helping with washing, perhaps carrying a younger sibling on her hip. These tasks trained her hands in patience, her mind in quiet repetition. The world beyond the tenement walls was vast and restless, yet her own sphere was contained, modest, defined by family and faith. But the city had ways of leaving its marks. Walking home at dusk, she would have heard the piano from the corner saloon drifting through open doors, notes of ragtime mingling with shouts of men and the clink of glasses. Such sounds told of another life running parallel to hers, a world of risk and revelry, of ambitions burning hotter than the steady warmth of her own household. Did she wonder then what might lie beyond the path laid for her, or did she shrink from it, content in the small certainties she knew? The answer is hidden, as so much of her life remains, yet it is within such questions that the shape of her story begins to form. In the neighborhood streets, the evenings often brought a gathering of voices, children skipping rope, women sharing news across thresholds, the smells of cabbage and stew rising from kitchen windows. Mary would have known laughter too, the simple joy of friendship, the comfort of belonging to a community that looked after its own. And yet, always there was that undercurrent of the city, restless and unruly, calling some young men to fight for territory, to join gangs whose names whispered through alleyways. It was a world that touched the edges of her own without fully entering it, at least not yet. She remained, for the moment, sheltered. And what of her dreams? Whispered as she lay awake in a narrow bed, the sound of rain tapping on the roof. Did she imagine herself a teacher, a nurse, a mother? Did she picture a small home, quiet and safe, with the laughter of children? Such imaginings are the secret possessions of youth, unrecorded yet profoundly real, and in her case they would be tested against a destiny that carried her far from the path of ordinariness. For in the years that followed, she would cross the path of a boy whose life ran to a different rhythm altogether, a rhythm of brashness, danger, and command. But in these earliest days, there was only Mary, the child of Irish Brooklyn, growing into a young woman. Her faith was the steady thread that ran through each moment, binding her to her community, to her family, and perhaps giving her the endurance she would later need. In her silence was a kind of strength, though neither she nor those around her yet knew how it would be called upon. The piano from the neighbor's window plays again in the imagination, soft at first, then louder, a tune mingling with the laughter of children outside. The evening gathers, the street lamps flicker into life, and Mary listens, as if her whole life were training her in the art of listening, an art she would one day practice in the very heart of silence and shadow. And so the first light of her story dims into twilight, leaving us at the edge of her youth, standing upon a street where cobblestones glisten with rain and music drifts from behind closed curtains. The piano notes lingered in the night, faint and wavering, as though played by unseen hands somewhere beyond the narrow streets of Brooklyn, and in that music the future seemed to stir. It was in such an atmosphere of chance, half lit by lamps and veiled by smoke, that Mary Josephine Coughlin first crossed paths with the young man who would one day be both her companion and her burden. He was Alphonse Capone, though in those years he was still more boy than man, a restless figure with quick eyes, a voice loud among his friends, and a laugh that cut through the hum of the street like a knife through cloth. Mary, with her quiet step and lowered gaze, seemed the very opposite of this youth, yet it is often in contrasts that destiny finds its threads. One imagines her walking home with her hands folded at her waist, her bonnet tied, when a burst of voices came from the stoop of a building where young men gathered. Al was among them, his cap tilted, his posture brash, his words peppered with jokes and defiance. Did she glance at him, shyly, or did his eyes fall upon her first, noting the stillness in her face, the way she passed without seeking notice? The streets of Brooklyn were small worlds of their own, and in time names and faces became familiar even to those who did not speak. Soon Mary knew the sound of his laughter before she saw him, and he knew the shape of her step before she drew near. Alphonse was a son of Naples, raised in a home where the struggle for survival bred quick tempers and quicker fists. He belonged to the rough camaraderie of immigrant boys who found their dignity in numbers, in the swagger of gangs that patrolled the corners, in the knowledge that their strength might win them a measure of respect denied by society at large. To Mary, such a world was foreign and perhaps frightening, Yet it also carried a magnetism, for within Al was a spark of boldness that contrasted sharply with the patient endurance of her own household. Where her father bowed his head in steady labor, Al raised his chin in defiance. Where her mother prayed for quiet stability, Al dreamed of more. What words passed between them in those early days is not preserved, yet we may imagine the tentative beginnings, the awkward courtesies softened by glances more eloquent than speech. Perhaps he teased her with the bravado of a boy eager to impress, and she, half smiling, looked away with the modesty of a girl trained in reserve. The courtship, if such it can be called, unfolded not in grand gestures, but in stolen moments. A pause at a street corner, a few steps walked together, the warmth of recognition when one face appeared among many. Brooklyn was a place where small lives intersected endlessly, where futures were set in motion by encounters that seemed trivial at the time. And yet, beyond the surface of youthful attraction, lay the deeper question of what Mary perceived in him. Did she sense already the danger that curled like smoke around his figure? Or did she see only a young man with charm enough to soften the hardness of his surroundings? Perhaps she saw both, and was drawn by the contradiction. For there is a truth that women, especially those taught to endure, often recognize: the restless spirit of a man who cannot be contained, and the hidden need within such a man for someone steady enough to bear the weight of his turbulence. As their acquaintance deepened, she found herself stepping further from the narrow boundaries of her girlhood. The world of Alphonse Capone was not one of quiet evenings by the fire, but of crowded gatherings, the smell of tobacco thick in the air, the sound of laughter that edged toward menace. Among his companions, Mary was a figure of calm, her silence contrasting with the bluster of the young men around her. She did not belong to that world, yet her presence there seemed to steady it, as if even Al, in his rough way, recognized the value of her gentleness. There were whispers, too, among neighbors. A good Irish girl keeping company with a hot-headed Italian youth. It was remarked upon in kitchens and at market stalls, where women exchanged knowing glances. Yet Mary did not turn away. Whether from affection, fascination, or the slow pull of inevitability, she allowed herself to remain within his orbit. And Al, who sought recognition wherever he could find it, must have felt a pride in walking beside her, for she lent him a measure of respectability he could not claim alone. The years then moved with quiet swiftness. She was nearing 20 when their bond grew into permanence, though it would be sealed under circumstances that offered little time for hesitation. Their union was not the leisurely flowering of romance, but the hurried binding of lives, already complicated by consequence. In late 1918, a child was born to them, Albert Francis, whom they called Sonny. His arrival preceded their wedding by a matter of weeks, and in that reversal of order lay the first shadow over their story. For a girl raised in the devout traditions of the church, such a beginning carried weight, and yet Mary bore it with the same silence that would define her life. She chose loyalty over scandal, binding herself to Al in marriage so that their son might carry a name unburdened by whispers. The ceremony was small, held within the quiet sanctuary of the parish, the smell of incense clinging to the air, the flicker of candles casting shadows across worn pews. Mary, dressed simply, stood beside Al, who perhaps shifted with restless energy even in that sacred space. Their vows were spoken softly, perhaps more hurriedly than the priest desired, yet they were vows nonetheless, and once spoken, they tied Mary's life forever to the man beside her. Outside, the streets carried on as they always did, indifferent to the promises made within, yet for Mary the path had been chosen. It is here, at this turning point, that one might pause to reflect. Did she feel joy, relief, resignation? Was she already aware that her life would be marked by the shadows cast by her husband's choices? Or did she still believe in the possibility of an ordinary happiness, in a home filled with laughter and the sound of her child's steps, Such questions are left unanswered, for she left behind no diary, no testimony of her heart. What we know is only the outline, a girl of Irish Brooklyn, quiet and modest, who became the wife of a man destined for notoriety. The piano music that had once drifted through her childhood streets might have still played in her memory as she stood at the threshold of marriage, though now it sounded different, darker, touched by the awareness that her life was no longer her own. The candle flames guttered in the draught of the church, casting long shadows, and when the final blessing was given, Mary lowered her eyes, not knowing that she had just stepped into a story that would make her name both hidden and immortal. And so we leave her for the moment at the church door, the faint music of her childhood still echoing, mingling now with the rough laughter of Alphonse and his companions as they lead her into a new world whose dangers she cannot yet see. The church door closed behind them, and the faint scent of incense still clung to Mary's veil as she stepped into the chill of the outside air, where the shouts of men and the rattle of carriages swallowed the solemn silence she had just left. The sound of Alphonse's companions laughing, boisterous and unrestrained, seemed to clash with the sacred vows spoken only moments before. Yet Mary did not falter. She lowered her eyes, adjusted her gloves, and took her husband's arm, as though, by that simple gesture, she might steady herself against the vast unknown that stretched before her. The wedding had been swift, born less of careful planning than of necessity. Their son, Albert Francis, little Sonny, as he would be called, had already been born. His arrival had cast urgency over the ceremony, ensuring that vows were exchanged quickly so that the family might be properly bound in the eyes of both church and society. For Mary, raised within the Irish Catholic tradition, where propriety carried heavy weight, this reversal of order was not without sting. Yet she bore it as she bore all things, quietly, without protest, as though her silence could weave a protective veil over herself and the fragile child who now rested in her arms. In the days that followed, their modest rooms filled with the cries of the newborn. Sonny was delicate, his health uncertain from the very beginning, and Mary spent long nights rocking him in the dim light of a kerosene lamp, whispering prayers into the darkness. The world outside might have been shifting toward prohibition and turmoil, but within those walls, her universe was narrowed to the rhythm of her child's breathing, the warmth of his small body pressed against her chest. The church bells of Brooklyn marked the hours, but time itself seemed measured not in minutes, but in the fragile pauses between his coughs. Al, restless by nature, was not easily contained within the role of husband and father. He adored his son in his own way, yet the lure of the streets, the promise of opportunity in the growing underworld of New York and Chicago, called him with greater urgency than domestic duty ever could. He came and went with irregularity, his presence filling the room with vitality when he was near and leaving silence in his absence. Mary learned quickly not to ask where he had been, not to press him with questions he had no wish to answer. Instead, she busied herself with Sonny's care, with the keeping of a home that was more a refuge than a foundation. Their union, though sealed by vows, was never one of equals. Mary's role became that of stillness, of creating calm amid turbulence, of bearing the weight of what was unsaid. To outsiders, she was the dutiful wife, modestly dressed, her hair neatly pinned, her words few. To those who looked more closely, she was a figure of endurance, standing quietly at the edge of a life that was already threatening to outgrow its boundaries. Al's temper, his ambitions, his reckless energy, these were forces that no gentle hand could tame, not even hers. And yet she remained, binding herself more tightly to him, not through control, but through persistence. Their small family might have lived unnoticed, as so many others did in the crowded quarters of Brooklyn, had history not chosen Alphonse for its own purposes. The tides of change were sweeping across America. Prohibition was about to begin, a law that would close the saloons but open vast empires of illicit trade. For a man like Al, with his quick wit and quicker fists, such an age offered opportunities beyond imagining. For Mary, it offered trials she could not yet foresee. She might have dreamed of a quiet home, of children playing in a yard, of evenings spent in peace. Instead, the path she had taken would lead her into mansions and into shadows, into wealth and into isolation, into a life defined by secrecy and silence. Sonny, fragile and precious, became her anchor. His health was never strong, his hearing impaired, and Mary poured into him all the tenderness she could muster. She shielded him from noise, from cold, from the roughness of the streets. In her arms he found a world of safety, one that she tried to hold intact, even as his father's world grew more dangerous with each passing year. There was in her care a devotion that bordered on sacrifice, as though she knew already that he might be her only true possession, the only soul who belonged wholly to her, in a life increasingly consumed by another's fame. And yet, in those early days of marriage, there must have been moments of hope, moments when she looked at Al and saw not the shadow of the gangster he would become, but the young man who had once laughed from a stoop in Brooklyn. Perhaps she remembered the first glances exchanged, the way his eyes had softened when they fell upon her, the way he had carried their infant son with pride. These fleeting visions of normalcy, of tenderness, may have sustained her, convincing her that beneath the bluster lay something worth holding to. Still, doubt must have crept in. When he stayed away too long, when whispers reached her of his temper, of his dealings, of the violence that clung to his name, did she close her ears, or did she hear and simply choose silence? In her silence was both strength and prison, a refusal to confront that which she could not change, a shield against a truth too heavy to bear. Women of her time and circumstance often endured without speech, believing that loyalty itself was virtue enough, even if it came at the cost of self. The years between 1918 and 1920 would mark the quiet foundation of their family, yet beneath that foundation, cracks were already forming. Al was drawn more and more toward Chicago, a city whose restless energy promised fortunes to those willing to grasp them, and soon Mary would find herself pulled away from the familiar streets of her girlhood into a place far larger, far more perilous. The decision was not hers to make. She followed, as wives then were expected to do, carrying Sonny with her, her possessions modest, her resolve cloaked in silence. One might picture her, on the eve of departure, standing by the window of their Brooklyn home, looking out at the street she had known since childhood. The lamps flickered, the sound of a piano drifted once more from a neighbor's parlor, children's laughter echoed faintly in the distance. It was a world she was leaving behind, perhaps forever, and in that moment the future must have seemed both vast and uncertain. She touched her son's forehead as he slept, whispering a prayer into the darkness, and wondered what lay ahead in the city of Chicago, where her husband's ambitions were leading them. The incense of the wedding still lingered in her memory, but now it was joined by the scent of smoke rising from distant trains, carrying them away from all that was known. The door of her childhood was closing behind her, and another door, larger and heavier, was about to open. One that led into the shadowed halls of a life she had not chosen yet would endure. The unopened envelope lay upon the table, its paper yellowed at the edges, as though time itself had pressed its weight upon it. Mary's hand hovered above it more than once, tracing the curve of the inked name without breaking the seal. It was from Al, sent ahead during those first days in Chicago, when he moved swiftly among strangers, while she remained behind in Brooklyn, gathering her strength, tending to Sonny, and preparing for the journey that would alter the very air she breathed. She did not read it at once, for in her heart she already knew what words it must contain. Promises of safety, of prosperity, of a place for her and their child in a city where fortune waited. Yet promises, even written in her husband's bold hand, could not disguise the unease that stirred quietly within her. When at last she stepped from the train into Chicago, the city rose around her in a vastness unlike anything she had known. Brooklyn had been crowded and familiar, its streets narrow but predictable, its neighbors familiar faces. Chicago was a different creature altogether. Broad avenues lined with new stone buildings, a sky thick with smoke from factories, the smell of meat-packing plants heavy in the wind, the rattle of streetcars, and the endless press of strangers. It was a place that hummed with ambition, but beneath that hum was a darker rhythm, one she could feel but not yet name. Mary clutched Sonny close as she walked beside Al, who seemed to stride through the city as though it belonged to him already. His voice carried above the din, his step was firm, and he pointed with pride at the rising skyline, promising that here their family would thrive. Yet to Mary the grandeur felt cold, the distances between buildings vast, the shadows deeper. She thought of the neighbors she had left behind, of the church bells of Brooklyn, of the familiar scent of bread from her mother's oven. Here, everything was unfamiliar, and even the wind seemed harsher, cutting through her shawl with a bite that spoke of the Midwest rather than the Atlantic shore. Their new home was modest at first, though already Al's dealings brought in more money than she had ever seen pass through her father's hands. Furniture of polished wood, rugs thick enough to muffle footsteps, curtains of heavy fabric that shut out the gaze of the street. These things appeared quickly, and Mary busied herself arranging them, her silence deepening as her surroundings grew more lavish. To visitors, she was the picture of propriety, a quiet wife who kept her house in order and her child close by. Yet behind closed doors, she felt the strangeness of it all, the sense that the walls themselves were listening, that the wealth, which came so swiftly, carried with it a stain, unseen but palpable. Al was often absent, drawn into the labyrinth of Chicago's underworld, where Prohibition had opened a river of opportunity for those daring enough to seize it. Mary waited through evenings when the lamps burned low and the clock ticked into silence, her son asleep in his room while she sat by the window, watching the empty street below. Sometimes footsteps approached, and her heart lifted, only to fall again when they passed by. When at last Al returned, it was with the smell of smoke and liquor clinging to him, his voice quick with triumph or tight with anger, depending on the night. She did not ask questions. She had learned already that silence was safer, that her role was to receive him without judgment, to provide the stillness he needed but did not seek elsewhere. And yet there were moments when doubt pressed heavily upon her. She thought of the unopened envelope, of the promises it contained, and she wondered if they had already begun to dissolve into the air. The city was not a place of peace, and she knew in her bones that the path Al was walking would bring both fortune and danger. Still, she stayed, as if bound not only by vows but by the small boy who bore their name and whose future she was determined to protect. Sonny's health remained delicate, his hearing imperfect, and Mary poured herself into his care with a devotion that seemed to make the rest of the world fall away. She shielded him from noise, from the harshness of the city, from the shadow of his father's dealings. Each morning she dressed him neatly, combed his hair, and whispered prayers over him, as though by these rituals she could create a shield strong enough to withstand the turbulence around them. For her, motherhood was not merely duty but salvation, a way of giving meaning to a life otherwise governed by forces she could neither control nor fully understand. Chicago's winters were long and brutal, the streets crusted with ice, the wind howling through the gaps in the walls. Mary learned to keep the house warm, to mend clothes swiftly, to carry on even when the cold seemed to seep into her very bones. She wrote letters back to Brooklyn, though fewer than she might have wished, for the demands of her new life consumed her time and her strength. The letters spoke of Sonny's growth, of the new home, of her prayers for her family's health. They did not speak of Al's absences, nor of the whispers she had begun to hear from neighbors and visitors, whispers of violence, of deals struck in smoky rooms, of names spoken in fear. One evening, as she sat by the table with a letter half-written before her, she paused, pen suspended, listening to the faint sound of footsteps outside. She thought for a moment that Al had returned, but the steps passed by and the silence deepened once more. The unopened envelope, now tucked away in a drawer, seemed to echo in her mind, its seal still unbroken, its promises unanswered. She wondered if perhaps it was better left unread, a relic of hope untouched by the reality that had followed. There is a peculiar sorrow in such moments, a recognition that one's life is no longer one's own, that choices have been made and paths taken from which there is no return. Mary carried that sorrow quietly, never speaking it aloud, yet it colored her days, even as she smiled gently at her son, even as she kept her home with care. She bore it as she bore all things, in silence, with a strength that was invisible to the world but essential to her survival. And so the unopened envelope remained where she had placed it, its paper yellowing further with each season, a symbol of all that had been promised and all that would remain unfulfilled. Outside, the city roared with ambition, with violence, with wealth and ruin intertwined. Inside, Mary kept her vigil, her silence, her devotion, as the shadows of Chicago began to close more tightly around her. The night deepened, the lamp flickered low, and from somewhere in the distance came again the sound of a piano, its notes drifting faintly through the cold air, reminding her of a childhood street far away, a street she would never truly walk again. The piano note lingered, fading into the distance as if carried on the cold Chicago wind, and in that sound Mary stepped more firmly into the life that awaited her in the vast city. The grandeur struck her first, for Chicago was proud of its wide boulevards and the new towers that seemed to scrape the very sky, proud of its theaters and hotels where light spilled onto the pavements in golden sheets. But beneath that grandeur lurked menace, a pulse of danger that beat through the city's alleys and whispered through its crowded taverns, even though liquor had been declared forbidden. Mary, with her quiet step and lowered eyes, absorbed it all, both the shimmer of wealth and the shadow of threat, and she could not always tell where one ended and the other began. Al was already at home here. He strode through the streets as though they belonged to him, his voice louder than the roar of streetcars, his gestures wide and confident. He pointed out the buildings rising along Michigan Avenue, spoke of men he had met, deals he had made, fortunes that might be theirs. To Mary, it was dizzying, this sudden promise of abundance. She looked at the polished stone facades, at the bustling shops, and then at her son, small and fragile, at her side, and wondered if such a place could ever truly be home. Their residence grew more lavish with each passing month. At first modest, it soon bore the marks of wealth, rugs thick beneath the feet, furniture carved with delicate patterns, curtains so heavy that they shut out the world beyond. Chandeliers caught the light and scattered it across the ceilings, mirrors reflected faces and doubled the sense of space. Visitors arrived, men in sharp suits and women draped in silks, their laughter ringing loudly in rooms that only a year earlier had been silent. Mary moved among them quietly, offering polite nods, her words few, her presence more ornamental than participatory. To the eyes of strangers she was the dutiful wife, gracious and restrained, but beneath that surface she carried the unease of one who senses that luxury has been purchased at a price unseen but heavy. There were nights when the halls echoed with voices and music, when glasses clinked and smoke hung thick in the air, and Mary would retreat to Sonny's room, sitting at his bedside while the noise of revelry pressed through the walls. She held his hand as he slept, whispering prayers that his ears, already troubled, would not catch the din, that his dreams might remain untouched by the chaos outside. For her, the child was the axis upon which all else turned, the one true responsibility that grounded her in a world that seemed increasingly unmoored. Chicago in those years was a city of contradictions. By day, it boasted progress, commerce, and growth. By night, it revealed its hidden heart, where bootleggers, gamblers, and enforcers carved out kingdoms beneath the law. Mary did not speak of such things, yet she felt their presence in the way men lowered their voices when Al's name was mentioned, in the guarded looks exchanged across tables, in the occasional trace of blood upon a collar, hastily changed before entering her sight. She knew enough to know that silence was her shield, that questions unasked might spare her grief, at least for a time. When she did venture into the city on her own, accompanied by Sonny, she moved quietly, a modest figure amid the bustle. She shopped for food, for clothes, sometimes for the small comforts that made a home feel human amid all the grandeur. The market smelled of spices and smoke. The air carried the noise of countless tongues, and she walked through it all as though encased in glass, distant from the life around her. Women glanced at her, whispered, perhaps wondering how such a quiet soul came to be tied to a man whose name was increasingly spoken in both awe and fear. She met their eyes only briefly, offering a small nod, then turned away, retreating once more into her silence. Within the house, the rooms began to feel too large, the ceilings too high. Mary filled them with small acts of care, flowers placed in vases, linens folded neatly, meals prepared with attention. Yet even these acts seemed swallowed by the scale of it all, as though no human touch could soften the edges of a home built on wealth that came too quickly, too easily. At night, when the lamps were extinguished and shadows stretched long, she lay awake, listening to the faint sounds of the city, the whistle of a train, the distant shouts of men, the occasional gunshot muffled by distance. These sounds reminded her that grandeur and menace were two faces of the same coin, inseparable in the world Al had chosen. And Al himself, though affectionate in moments, grew increasingly absorbed by his empire. He returned late, his energy volatile, his attention divided. To Mary he offered brief reassurances, touches upon the shoulder, words of comfort that rang hollow against the growing weight of absence. She accepted them with bowed head, offering no challenge, for she knew already that her voice carried little power in the tides that swept him. Instead, she held to Sonny, to the small rituals of care, to the endurance that had defined her since childhood. There were days when the city's grandeur tempted her, when she walked along the lakefront and felt the sweep of the horizon, the openness of the water. For a moment she could imagine freedom, could imagine a life not bound by shadows. But then she returned to the mansion, to the heavy curtains and the silence of her own restraint, and the vision dissolved. She belonged to Al, and through him to the world he had built, and there was no turning back. As the seasons turned, Mary's sense of isolation deepened. Neighbors greeted her politely but distantly. Acquaintances visited but never lingered. The men who came to see Al carried with them attention that seeped into the walls, and the women who accompanied them laughed too loudly, their eyes sharp with curiosity. Mary played her part, smiling faintly, speaking little, fading into the background. Invisibility became her armor, and she wore it well. One evening, as a gathering swelled within the house, Mary stood at the top of the stairs, looking down upon the glittering scene below. Al was in the center, laughing, gesturing, commanding the room with ease. Around him swirled smoke, laughter, the clink of glasses. For a moment she thought of the boy she had first seen on a Brooklyn stoop, cap tilted, voice loud among his companions. He had not changed, she realized, only grown louder, larger, more dangerous, and she, who had once walked past him with lowered eyes, was now bound to him, a shadow upon the edge of his light. The grandeur of the mansion shimmered, but to Mary it seemed hollow, filled with echoes rather than substance. She turned away, retreating into the quiet of Sonny's room, where her son slept peacefully, untouched for the moment by the tumult below. She smoothed his hair, kissed his forehead, and whispered again the prayers that had become her constant refrain. Outside, the city roared, a beast of ambition and menace. Inside, Mary kept her vigil, her silence, her devotion. And somewhere, faint and distant, the echo of a piano played once more, its notes weaving through the night like threads of memory, reminding her of the narrow streets she had left behind and of the life that seemed to drift further from her reach with each passing day. The sound of footsteps echoed across marble halls, steady at first and then fading into silence, as though the house itself had absorbed them. Mary paused on the stairway, her hand resting lightly upon the polished rail, and listened to that silence settle like dust upon the rooms. This was the house of her life now, grand, imposing, filled with light, by day and shadow by night, a house that seemed always half empty despite the laughter and revelry it often contained. Al's empire had grown swiftly, branching like roots beneath the soil of Chicago, drawing wealth from the forbidden streams of liquor, and with that wealth came a parade of extravagance that Mary moved among as though in a dream. The rooms glistened with finery, chandeliers dripped with crystal, polished floors reflected the glow of lamps, tables were laden with silverware that gleamed even when untouched. Yet for Mary, these objects spoke not of comfort, but of unease. She kept her steps soft upon the floors, careful with her voice, as though she might disturb the fragile balance that kept everything in place. The luxury around her was undeniable. Silks hung in her wardrobe, perfumes rested upon her vanity, jewels occasionally pressed into her hand by a husband, too busy to notice that she wore them rarely. To those who saw only the surface, she must have seemed blessed beyond measure. But to Mary, each shimmer carried a shadow. Each gift seemed weighted with the knowledge of its cost. There were parties, many of them. Music filled the halls, violins and trumpets blending with the laughter of guests, the air heavy with smoke and drink, though liquor was forbidden by law. Men toasted loudly, women's gowns rustled like waves, and Al stood at the center, his presence filling every corner. Mary was there too, though often unnoticed. She moved among the guests quietly, offering polite words when addressed, her face serene, her eyes lowered. Some women preened under the light of admiration, but Mary seemed to prefer invisibility, to glide through the scene like a ghost. Perhaps she understood already that her role was not to shine, but to endure, to be the silent anchor in a world swirling with noise. And yet, in rare moments, she felt the touch of fragility upon her heart. Watching Al laugh with companions, slap shoulders, command attention with his boldness, she wondered where the line lay between admiration and fear. The men who surrounded him laughed, but their laughter often carried an edge, as though caution walked beside it. The women sparkled, but their glances were sharp, measuring, curious. Mary, in her modesty, knew she was different from them. She did not chase attention. She did not seek applause. She existed at the edges, steady, unseen, her silence both shield and prison. When the guests departed and the music died away, silence fell once more, heavier than before. A single glass would remain unfinished upon the table, the imprint of lips upon its rim, the liquid within gone flat. Mary would clear it away, her fingers brushing the cool surface, as though by touching it she might erase the echoes of the night. In those moments she felt the loneliness of her station most keenly, the knowledge that her life was both full and empty, crowded with others yet deeply isolated. Outside, the city continued its restless rhythm. Sirens wailed in the distance, trains rumbled, voices rose in alleyways. Inside, Mary tended to Sonny, to the duties of a mother and a wife. Her devotion to her son never faltered. His hearing troubles remained, and she spoke to him gently, guiding him with patience, protecting him from the harshness of both the city and his father's world. To her, Sonny was the reason for endurance, the purpose behind her silence. She sang to him softly at night, her voice a fragile thread of comfort woven against the noise beyond the walls. Sometimes Al joined them, his roughness softened briefly in the presence of his child. He would lift Sonny into his arms, laugh heartily, promise him wonders. Mary watched these moments with quiet eyes, torn between gratitude and sorrow, for she knew that such tenderness was fleeting, overshadowed by the demands of the empire that claimed her husband more fully with each passing day. She did not interfere, did not scold, did not remind him of absences. Instead, she accepted what moments were given, storing them in her heart as one stores fragile treasures. The life of luxury was not without danger. Mary knew this, even if no one spoke it aloud. The locked doors, the guards who lingered outside, the hurried whispers that hushed when she entered a room. These were signs enough. She felt it when Al returned late, his eyes sharp, his jaw set, his hands restless. She felt it in the way the house seemed always alert, as though listening for threats. Wealth had brought grandeur, but it had also brought peril, and Mary bore that knowledge silently, trusting her prayers more than the men with guns outside her door. There were days when she longed for the narrow streets of Brooklyn, for the familiar faces, for the simplicity of modest rooms filled with honest labor. Here in Chicago's marble halls, she felt the weight of wealth pressing against her shoulders, a weight she had never sought but could not set down. She thought often of her vows, spoken quickly, perhaps hurriedly in the church where incense still clung to the air. Those vows held her still, binding her to Al's path whether she wished it or not. She had promised loyalty, and she would keep it, though it cost her the life she might have dreamed for herself. One evening, when the party had ended and the house was quiet, Mary lingered in the dining room. A single glass of champagne stood upon the table, its bubbles long vanished, its surface dulled. She lifted it, held it to the light, and for a moment she thought of all that it symbolized: celebration, wealth, triumph. And of all it concealed: blood, betrayal, fear. She set it down again untouched and turned away, her steps soft against the marble floor. The echo of her footsteps joined the silence, filling the vast room with a sound that seemed smaller than the space deserved. The house slept, Al within his chambers, Sonny safe in his bed. Mary moved quietly through the halls, extinguishing lamps, drawing curtains, performing the rituals of closure. Yet in her heart, the question stirred. Was this truly life, or only the shadow of another's? Could silence itself be loyalty, or was it surrender? She did not answer them, not aloud, perhaps not even within herself. Instead, she let them linger, unresolved, like the faint glimmer of the glass left behind. And so the night closed around her, the marble halls once more swallowed in silence, the grandeur heavy, the menace unseen but ever present. She paused at the threshold of her room, listening for a moment to the quiet breathing of her child down the hall, and then stepped inside, leaving behind the unfinished glass, the echo of footsteps, and the unanswered questions that would follow her into sleep. The lullaby lingered in the air, fragile and low, as Mary's voice carried its soft thread through the dim light of Sonny's room. The boy lay beneath heavy quilts, his lashes resting against pale cheeks, his small hands curled loosely at his sides. She sang not for an audience, but for him alone, and for herself as well, for the act of singing gave her a fleeting sense of peace, a rhythm of calm that bound mother to child against the dissonance of the world outside. When the final note faded, it seemed to hover like breath upon the air before dissolving into silence. She remained seated at his bedside, her hand resting upon his hair, listening to the even rise and fall of his breathing, the the sound that reassured her more than any promise her husband could offer. Sonny was her life's devotion, the single constant in a world that shifted like sand beneath her feet. From his first breath, she had sensed his fragility, had known that his health was something delicate, a candle that could be extinguished too easily. His partial deafness, discovered early, had brought sorrow into her prayers, and yet also resolve. If the world would not bend to protect him, she would. If others turned their eyes from his struggle, she would be the shield that guarded him. Each day she carried this task as one carries a sacred relic, not with pride or complaint, but with reverence. Morning light revealed her devotion most clearly. She would rise quietly, moving through the house before others stirred, tending to small tasks so that the day might begin in order. When Sonny awoke, she greeted him with gentleness, dressing him with care, combing his hair so neatly that he seemed untouched by the chaos of the household. She spoke to him slowly, with patience, making sure that he caught her meaning even when his ears failed him. She repeated herself as often as needed, never showing frustration, for she believed that every word she gave him was a thread woven into the fabric of his strength. At times, she wondered whether Al truly understood the depth of his son's condition. He showed affection when he remembered, lifting the boy onto his lap, telling stories, offering toys. But his attentions were fleeting, and his empire demanded him more fully than his family ever could. Mary did not reproach him, for reproach would have been useless. Instead, she accepted what love he gave, and in the vast space between his visits, she filled her son's life with her own quiet devotion. She taught Sonny prayers, guided his small fingers over rosary beads, told him stories not of violence, but of saints, of ordinary goodness, of hope. In this way, she created a world for him that was untouched by the blood and smoke that surrounded their household. There were doctors, of course, summoned when needed. They examined the boy, offered remedies, spoke of limits. Their words were heavy, yet Mary bore them with calm, absorbing each syllable without letting her son see the shadow it cast. To him, she was always steady, always patient, always sure that he could thrive despite his challenges. Her faith became his foundation, her silence his shelter. She never allowed the boy to see her fear, though it pressed upon her heart each night as she knelt in prayer, whispering pleas into the darkness that God might spare him from further suffering. Outside the sanctuary of Sonny's room, the house roared with life. Men came and went, their footsteps heavy, their voices sharp. Al's name carried weight in every conversation, sometimes spoken with respect, sometimes with dread. Mary heard it all, yet never let it reach her son's ears. She closed the door softly when guests arrived. She drew curtains to block the glare of strangers' eyes. She turned his attention toward books, games, the small joys of childhood. Her greatest act of resistance was this protection, the creation of a cocoon in which her son could grow without knowing the full darkness of his father's realm. But even within that cocoon, shadows crept. The boy was not blind to the world beyond his window. He saw the guards, the locked gates, the tension in his mother's eyes when the doorbell rang after midnight. He asked questions, and Mary answered them with gentle evasions, offering explanations that soothed without revealing. She could not hide everything, yet she gave him enough hope to believe in normalcy, enough love to make him feel safe. It was not a perfect shield, but it was the best she could weave from silence and prayer. There were moments of pure tenderness that Mary cherished like jewels. Sonny's laughter when she read him a story, his small hand in hers as they walked along the lake, his drowsy smile when she sang him to sleep. In these moments, she forgot the noise of the world beyond the walls, forgot even her own loneliness. In his eyes, she saw her purpose, her reason for bearing the life she had chosen, or perhaps the life that had chosen her. For in truth, she had not chosen grandeur, nor crime, nor notoriety. She had chosen only loyalty, and through that loyalty, she had been bound to Al. But in her son, she found something of her own, something untouched by the vows that had tethered her to a man larger than life. Al noticed this devotion, though perhaps he did not fully understand it. He would remark on Sonny's neatness, his good manners, his quietness, and Mary would only nod, never seeking recognition for the endless labor that produced such traits. Recognition mattered little to her. What mattered was that her son grew strong enough to face a world that might otherwise overwhelm him. If she could give him that strength, then her silence, her sacrifices, her endurance would not be in vain. And yet, even as she devoted herself to her son, Mary could not escape the sorrow that lay beneath her love. She knew that Sonny would always carry burdens others did not, that his hearing would isolate him, that his father's name would follow him wherever he went. She prayed not only for his health, but for his future, whispering words into the night that he might be spared the full weight of his inheritance. She prayed, too, for herself, that she might have the strength to continue, to protect him, to endure whatever storms might come. On evenings when the house grew loud with voices, she remained with her son until sleep claimed him, then sat alone in the dim room, listening to the faint echoes from beyond the door. She thought of her own childhood, of the narrow streets of Brooklyn, of the piano music drifting from a neighbor's window. She wondered if Sonny would ever know such simplicity, if he would ever walk freely among ordinary children without the shadow of his father's empire pressing down upon him. Such thoughts brought tears, yet she wiped them quickly, for tears solved nothing. Instead, she placed another kiss upon his forehead, whispered another prayer, and turned down the lamp. The lullaby remained in her mind even after she stopped singing, a melody that seemed to weave itself into the silence of the house. As she left his room, closing the door softly behind her, the notes still lingered in her ears, a reminder that love, however fragile, could create its own music even in the shadow of menace. She stepped into the hallway where the floor was cold beneath her feet, and the house stretched vast and silent once more, save for the distant murmur of men's voices and the echo of laughter that carried a sharpness she could not ignore. The creak of a door not fully closed lingered in Mary's mind, though she had not touched it herself. It was the kind of sound that unsettles, that suggests something unseen pressing from the other side, waiting to enter. In her life, it was not a door, but a whisper, a murmur from the lips of women and men alike, carried in half-heard conversations and veiled glances. The whisper spoke of Al's faithlessness, of women who laughed too loudly in his company, of shadows that clung to him, even when he came home to her. Mary never asked, never confronted, but she heard. Silence did not keep the truth away. It only made it harder to bear. When Al returned from his nights away, he carried with him the scent of tobacco, of drink, of perfume not her own. His voice was warm at times, eager to charm, to reassure her with gifts, with gestures of affection. Yet in those gestures, she sometimes felt distance, as though he sought to cover something already known but unspoken. Mary received his offerings with quiet grace, thanking him, placing the trinkets where they would not be seen too often. For what were gifts compared to loyalty? What were jewels against faithfulness? They glittered, but their light was cold, unable to warm the ache within her chest. Rumor is a subtle poison. It does not strike swiftly, but seeps slowly into the veins, altering perception, bending thoughts. Mary felt it in the way neighbors' eyes lingered upon her, pitying or curious, in the way laughter at gatherings sometimes seemed edged with knowledge. Did they all know more than she? Did they see her as a figure to be pitied, a woman standing loyally beside a man whose heart wandered freely? She did not ask, for to ask was to invite answers she could not change. Instead, she bore it as she bore all things, with silence that grew heavier by the day. Her prayers deepened in those years. She knelt longer before her rosary, her whispers more urgent, though never loud enough to wake Sonny. She prayed for her husband's soul, for her son's future, for her own strength to endure. Yet she also prayed, though she would never confess it, that the whispers might prove false, that her faith in her marriage, however fragile, might not be built upon sand. But faith is not always rewarded with clarity, and so she rose from prayer as uncertain as when she had begun, the creak of that unseen door still sounding within her mind. Al never spoke of other women to her, and she never pressed him. His absences lengthened, his temper sometimes flared, but he returned always to her house, to her table, to her son. Was that enough? For some women, perhaps not. For Mary, raised in a world where loyalty was duty and silence was virtue, it had to be. She carried herself with dignity in public, her chin lowered, her words measured, giving no sign that her heart was troubled. If her nights were sleepless, if her tears fell unheard into the folds of her pillow, no one knew. She would not give the world the satisfaction of seeing her break. There were moments, though, when the strain became almost visible. Sitting by the window, her sewing in her lap, her eyes unfocused, she seemed to drift far from the room. Sonny would call her and she would return swiftly, forcing a smile, hiding the distance that had crept in. To him she gave everything, for he was innocent, untouched by the failings of his father. Her love for her son was the anchor that kept her steady, the reason she could continue when whispers threatened to drown her. For him, she endured. For him, she held her silence. For him, she transformed sorrow into patience. Chicago itself seemed to echo her state of mind. The city glittered with wealth, with opportunity, but beneath its surface lay corruption, betrayal, and decay. The newspapers spoke of violence, of men shot in alleys, of deals struck in secret, and Al's name often hovered just behind the lines. Mary read the papers with care, folding them neatly afterward, never letting her son glimpse the shadows within. She wondered if her husband's infidelities were of the same nature as his empire, necessary to him, unavoidable, perhaps even inevitable. Such reflections offered no comfort, only resignation. Still, there were nights when she dared to hope. Al would sit with her at the table, speaking warmly of plans, of the future, of Sonny's education. He would touch her hand, his eyes soft for a moment, and she would feel again the spark of the young man she had once known on a Brooklyn stoop. These moments were rare but precious, enough to remind her that her life was not entirely shadow. She clung to them, though she knew they were fleeting, though she suspected that outside the walls of their home, other hands touched him, other voices called his name. In the stillness of night, when the house was quiet and even the city seemed hushed, she sometimes rose from her bed and walked the halls alone. The marble floors chilled her feet, the curtains swayed faintly in the draft, the silence pressed heavily around her. She would pause at a door, her hand resting on the knob, and hear again that imagined creak, the sound of something left ajar. It was as though her marriage itself was such a door, closed enough to suggest security, but never fully shut, never fully hers. She did not open it. She let it remain half closed, half true, half hers and half not, and in that uneasy space she made her life. It is said that silence can be a form of strength, but it can also be a wound. For Mary, it was both. Her silence shielded her from confrontation, preserved her dignity, allowed her to continue, but it also hollowed her, leaving her unseen, her pain unspoken, her worth measured only in her ability to endure. She lived in the shadow not only of her husband's empire, but of his betrayals. And in that shadow she raised her son, kept her faith, and walked each day with quiet resolve. The whispers never stopped. They ebbed and flowed, sometimes loud, sometimes faint, but always present, like a draft through the house that no door could fully shut. Mary carried them with her, invisible yet heavy, and each day she returned to her prayers, to her child, to her silence. The door remained half-closed, its creak echoing faintly in her mind, a reminder that some truths are never spoken aloud, yet never cease to exist. And so the night would end, as it always did, with Mary lying awake beside a man whose dreams she could not enter, listening to the faint noises of the house, the sigh of curtains, the creak of hinges, the whisper of rumor that never truly left. The perfume of roses wilting in a vase lingered in the parlor, faint and bittersweet, their petals curling at the edges, their color fading into dusk. Mary noticed them as she entered the room, a gift brought by one of the other wives who had visited days before. The flowers, once proud and vibrant, now drooped under their own weight, and in them Mary saw a reflection of herself and the women she met in such company, blooming for a season in the glow of wealth, yet destined to fade in silence, carrying secrets no perfume could mask. It was at gatherings and teas, or during the quiet moments after the men had departed for their business, that Mary sometimes found herself in the company of those wives, women bound by similar fates, drawn into the orbit of men who lived by violence and ambition. They came in silks, their hair adorned with jewels, their laughter light but guarded. They were women who understood too well what it meant to live with both abundance and fear. In their glances, quick and sharp, there was recognition, a silent acknowledgement that they were kin, not by blood but by circumstance. Mary spoke little at such gatherings, content to listen as others filled the air with talk of gowns, children, dinners, and the endless rumors of who had risen and who had fallen in the shifting order of their husband's world. Yet beneath those polite words lay an unspoken current, a shared understanding that their lives were precarious, that the walls of luxury around them were built upon sand. Sometimes, in the middle of laughter, silence would fall for a moment too long, and their eyes would meet across the table. In that silence was everything they could not say: fear for their children, distrust of their men, sorrow for the blood that paid for their jewels. Mary noticed how some women carried themselves with bravado, flaunting their wealth as if to prove they were more than shadows of their husbands. Others wore their silence as heavily as she did, their eyes lowered, their voices subdued. Yet all of them shared a common burden, the need to survive in the shadow of men whose names were both feared and celebrated. They were queens of an empire that was never truly theirs, guardians of homes that could be taken in an instant. There were moments of gentleness, too. One woman, older and sharp-eyed, leaned close to Mary once and whispered, "You are not alone." Nothing more, and yet it was enough. Another, younger and less guarded, confided in hushed tones about her husband's infidelities, about the nights she lay awake listening to his footsteps return at dawn. Mary listened, offered a small nod, and though she spoke no comfort aloud, her silence itself seemed to offer companionship. These exchanges were fragile, as fleeting as the scent of the roses in the vase, but they mattered, for they reminded Mary that even in her isolation, she was part of a hidden sisterhood. Still, trust among them was never complete. The women knew that words could be dangerous, that confidences might travel back to the men, that even friendship was a risk. So they spoke in half-truths, in hints and glances, their bond expressed more in what was withheld than in what was said. Mary learned to read the subtleties, the tightening of a jaw, the flicker of fear in an eye, the sudden pause in laughter. These became their language, a way of surviving together while saying almost nothing. After such visits, Mary often returned to her own rooms, where the flowers they brought would begin to wilt, their perfume lingering long after the women had gone. She would sit in the quiet and think of them, of the lives they endured, of the burdens they shared. In the roses she saw beauty and fragility entwined, the inevitability of fading despite appearances of vitality. She thought of herself in the same way, a woman who appeared serene to the world, yet bore within her a sorrow that could not be spoken. At times she wondered whether they envied her quietness, her ability to fade into the background? Or did they pity her, seeing in her silence a surrender they could not imagine for themselves? The truth she never knew, for none of them spoke openly enough to answer. Yet she carried their glances with her, the weight of their unspoken words, as though each had left behind not only roses, but a fragment of their own silent grief. Evenings after such gatherings often passed slowly. Mary would sit by Sonny's bedside, brushing his hair with gentle strokes, the scent of roses still clinging faintly to her clothes. She wondered what kind of women the wives might have been had their lives taken different paths. Teachers, mothers in ordinary homes, shopkeepers' daughters who grew old in peace. Instead, they lived in mansions, adorned and guarded, their futures tied irrevocably to men who walked with violence in their shadows. And she, Mae Capone, was among them, though she still sometimes thought of herself as the girl from Brooklyn who once walked past a stoop where a young man laughed too loudly. There were nights when the house was quiet, and she passed the vase again, catching the faint sweetness of the roses as they bent their heads toward the table. She would touch one petal lightly, feeling its softness begin to wither beneath her finger. The perfume lingered even as the bloom decayed, and she thought of the women she had sat with earlier, their laughter bright though their hearts were heavy. She thought of herself, too, enduring in silence, fading perhaps, but still carrying within her the essence of devotion, the perfume of love for her son, the quiet dignity that no decay could erase. The roses eventually dropped their petals, scattering upon the polished surface of the table like small sighs. Mary gathered them carefully, not rushing, as though each petal deserved respect even in its fall. She placed them gently aside, her movements deliberate, her silence deep. In the emptiness of the vase, she saw again the truth of her life, the appearance of beauty, the inevitability of fading, the persistence of memory even after the bloom is gone. And so the perfume of roses lingered faintly in the air long after the flowers had withered, as though reminding her that what is unseen can remain long after the visible has vanished. The house grew still, the echoes of laughter gone, the footsteps faded. Mary sat alone, her hands folded in her lap, listening to the silence. Outside, the city roared with its endless hunger, but within these walls she held fast to her own quiet, her own unseen strength, as the last trace of perfume drifted through the night. The candle guttered at the feast, its flame bending low in the draught as laughter and music swelled around it. Mary's eyes lingered upon that wavering light, small and fragile, amid the noise of the grand table. The feast was one of many in those years when Al's empire stood at its highest, when wealth poured in like a river unchecked, when their name was spoken in every corner of the city with awe or fear. The room glowed with abundance, tables spread with silver platters, crystal glasses catching the light, servants moving swiftly to refill cups and replace dishes. The guests raised their voices in cheer, their faces flushed with wine and triumph. Yet Mary remained quiet at her place, watching the candle struggle to hold its flame against the currents that swept the room. To the world beyond these walls, Alphonse Capone had become a king. His reach extended into politics, into law enforcement, into the very streets where bootleg liquor flowed despite every decree against it. His empire was vast, and with it came a reputation both feared and envied. For Mary, this height of power translated into a life surrounded by finery. She wore gowns of satin, shoes of leather too soft for the rough cobbles of her childhood, and jewels that sparkled, though she rarely let them rest long upon her skin. The house grew ever more opulent, each room adorned with evidence of Al's success. Yet for all the grandeur, she often felt herself a guest rather than mistress, as though the home belonged to the empire more than to the family within. At banquets such as this one, Mary's role was clear: to sit beside her husband, her smile calm, her silence intact. The men spoke loudly of deals, of power, of enemies crushed, their words carrying bravado sharpened by danger. The women laughed lightly, their perfume mingling with the heavy scent of roasted meats and rich sauces. Servants hurried to and fro, and the sound of glasses clinking was constant. Through it all, Mary listened without appearing to, her gaze lowered to her plate, her thoughts turned inward. She was present but unseen, her presence lending Al respectability, as though her quiet dignity counterbalanced the roughness of his world. The candle flame flickered again, and Mary's mind wandered to the days before all of this, to the modest rooms in Brooklyn where light came from lamps of oil and meals were plain but honest. Here, abundance overflowed, yet she felt no greater peace. The more lavish the feast, the more hollow it seemed to her, as though the wealth itself carried within it a shadow that could not be dispelled by music or laughter. She did not envy the other women their gowns or jewels, for she knew that beneath their laughter lay fears not unlike her own. What good was a feast when the silence that followed it felt heavier than hunger? Al, at the head of the table, radiated energy, his laughter booming, his gestures commanding. He slapped the shoulders of his men, raised his glass high, declared victories with a pride that filled the room. For him, the feast was proof of power, a performance of triumph. For Mary, it was an echo, a moment that passed quickly into memory, leaving only the faint taste of bitterness behind. She wondered whether he noticed her quietness, whether he saw the way her eyes lingered on the candle rather than on the guests. Perhaps he did, but if so, he gave no sign. His world was too large, too noisy, to hear the silence at his own table. In the quieter moments between gatherings, Mary moved through the house with care. She tended to Sonny, kept the home in order, preserved a sense of stability amid the tumult. The empire might belong to Al, but the house remained her domain, and she shaped it with patience and restraint. She placed fresh flowers in vases, sewed small garments for her son, prepared meals for him with her own hands rather than relying on servants. These acts grounded her, reminding her that beneath the glitter of empire lay the ordinary threads of family life. Without them, she feared she might dissolve entirely into the shadow, and yet the shadow grew ever larger. Newspapers carried stories of violence, of men shot down in alleys, of corruption uncovered. Al's name was never absent from their pages, though often veiled, often suggested rather than spoken outright. Mary read these lines with quiet resignation, folding the papers neatly and setting them aside before Sonny could glimpse them. The world might be consumed by her husband's legend, but within her home she sought to keep at least one corner untouched, one room where innocence could survive. The feasts continued, as did the laughter and the boasting. Each time Mary took her place beside her husband, her hands folded, her eyes lowered, her silence unbroken. Each time she watched the candles gutter in the draughts, their flames trembling as though foretelling the fragility of all this grandeur. For what is power if it rests upon violence? What is wealth if it demands silence as its price? These questions stirred within her, unspoken, unanswered, lingering like the smoke of extinguished candles long after the guests had gone. When the rooms were empty, when the servants cleared the tables and the echoes of laughter faded, Mary often returned to gather the small remnants left behind. A fallen napkin, a glass half filled, a candle burnt low. She touched these objects as though they held meaning beyond their surface, as though in them lay the truth of what had transpired. The grandeur vanished with the guests, but the silence remained, and in that silence Mary heard her own heart, steady yet burdened. Sonny's laughter, faint and fragile, was the counterpoint to these nights. She held him close, sang to him, told him stories that had nothing to do with feasts or power. In his eyes she saw the possibility of something different, something gentler. She prayed that he would inherit not the empire but the endurance, not the noise but the quiet faith. For him she continued. For him she bore the hollow feasts, the whispers, the silences. And so the candle guttered, its flame shrinking as wax melted slowly until at last it extinguished itself in a faint curl of smoke. Mary watched as the smoke drifted upward, dissolving into the shadows of the grand hall. The feast was over, the empire still standing, but within her heart the image of that small flame remained, a reminder that even at the height of power, fragility waits quietly at the edge of every triumph. The pounding of the presses through the night rolled like thunder across the city, their rhythm steady, merciless, echoing through alleyways and into quiet homes. Mary heard it even within her own walls, faint but insistent, as if the world itself were stamping out a truth too heavy to be ignored. The newspapers would carry the tale before dawn, their headlines bold, their ink still damp with urgency. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, they would call it, though Mary herself never spoke the name aloud. She did not need the words to know the shadow it cast. The whispers that had once been confined to parlors and corridors now rose into the streets, printed in black upon white, carried to every doorstep. The world was watching, and in its gaze her husband's empire shifted from rumor to legend, from whispered power to infamous history. Mary sat in her parlor as the presses roared, the dim lamp at her side flickering, her rosary threaded through her fingers. She prayed, though she did not name what she prayed for. Was it for Al, that he might be spared, forgiven, hidden from the consequences of his deeds? Was it for Sonny, that his future might not be poisoned by the ink that now spread her husband's name across the city? Or was it for herself, that she might endure yet another burden in silence, her heart steady even as the ground beneath her trembled? She whispered the words, "Hail Mary, full of grace," and the rhythm of the beads steadied her hands, though it did not ease her spirit. The massacre itself she did not see, nor did she ask about it. Yet its presence entered her home nonetheless, carried in the tightened expressions of men who visited, in the hushed tones of servants who glanced nervously at one another in the absence of her husband for longer than usual. She knew, without knowing details, that something terrible had taken place, that lives had been taken in a manner brutal enough to shock even a city accustomed to blood. The newspapers would paint the pictures, would speak of lined-up men, of gunfire that cut them down, of violence precise and merciless. Mary did not read the words in full, yet their shadow fell upon her all the same. When Al returned, his face was taut, his manner brisk. He dismissed the questions of others with a wave, insisted that nothing could be proven, that the world would always talk, but the truth was not theirs to hold. Mary listened without speaking, her eyes lowered, her silence deeper than ever. She did not accuse, did not press. She had learned long ago that his world was not hers to interrogate. Yet as he spoke, she thought again of the pounding presses, of the ink spreading across pages, of the inevitability of memory. Words printed could not be unprinted, and though he dismissed them, she felt their weight settling over her house like snow upon a roof. In the days that followed, the air within the mansion grew heavier. Guests arrived still, but their laughter was tighter, their voices lowered. The women glanced more often toward Mary, as though searching her face for reaction, for confirmation, for some sign of how a wife endured such things. She gave them nothing. Her expression remained calm, her words polite, her silence unbroken. If they pitied her, she bore it. If they envied her endurance, she did not show it. She became, in those days, a figure of stone, unyielding on the surface, though within her heart the sorrow deepened like a wound. Sonny, shielded as much as she could manage, asked questions. Why were the men outside more watchful than before? Why did people speak his father's name in such tones? Mary smoothed his hair, smiled faintly, told him only that the world sometimes misunderstood, that his father was strong, that he need not fear. She could not tell him the truth, not because she did not wish him to know, but because the truth itself was a burden too great for his fragile health, his tender years. She believed that protecting him from such knowledge was her duty, even if one day it meant he would discover it on his own. The city changed in those weeks. Fear grew thicker, suspicion spread, and the name Capone appeared more often in headlines than any other. For some, he was a hero of defiance, a man who outwitted the law. For others, he was a monster, a figure of cruelty and corruption. For Mary, he was still the boy she had once passed on a Brooklyn stoop, still the husband whose footsteps echoed in her halls, still the father of her son. Yet she could not deny that he was also becoming something larger, something darker, something that belonged not only to her but to history itself. One evening she sat by the window, the newspaper folded upon her lap, the scent of ink still sharp in the air. Outside, the street was quiet, snow falling softly, muffling the sounds of the city. She watched the flakes drift downward, each one fragile, each one vanishing as it touched the ground. In them she saw the fragility of peace, how quickly it vanished, how easily it was consumed by the world's hunger for noise and spectacle. The massacre had burned itself into the memory of the city, and she knew that from this moment onward nothing would be the same. The presses pounded still, night after night, carrying new stories, new rumors, new judgments. Mary closed her eyes and listened, the sound beating like a second heart in the distance. It was relentless, unstoppable, indifferent to her prayers. She thought of the candle guttering at the feast, its flame fragile yet persistent, and wondered if she too was such a flame, trembling but unextinguished, enduring even as the draughts threatened to snuff her out. When she rose from her chair and turned down the lamp, the house was quiet once more, but the echoes of the presses lingered in her ears. She walked softly through the halls, her steps silent upon the marble, her hand brushing the wall for steadiness. In the stillness she heard the faint breathing of her son, safe for now, and the restless turning of her husband in his sleep. Between those two sounds she carried her own silence, as heavy and as necessary as ever. And outside, through the falling snow, the presses pounded on, stamping the legend of her husband into permanence, their rhythm a reminder that even silence could not keep the world at bay. The rattle of handcuffs carried down the hallway, metallic and unyielding, echoing in the air long after the manacled figure had passed. Mary heard it first in imagination, before she ever heard it in truth, for whispers of trials and indictments had grown so constant that the sound seemed to live already in her mind. When at last the day arrived and Al's fate drew him into the cold grasp of the courts, the sound became real. It filled her ears as she sat silently in the wooden benches of the courtroom, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes lowered yet watchful. The clang of metal, the scrape of boots upon stone floors, the mutter of voices pressed too tightly together, all of it became the background to her endurance. The courtroom was not a place she ever imagined herself, not the kind of room her childhood prayers had prepared her to enter. Yet here she was, dressed in sober colors, her veil pinned neatly, her son kept far away from the proceedings. Around her gathered the curious, the press, the enemies, the allies, each one eager to witness the fall of a man who had risen so high. They stared at Al as if he were both spectacle and prey, and in their stares Mary felt the weight of her own invisibility. She sat quietly, almost forgotten, as though she were no more than a shadow in the room, though her heart beat heavily within her chest. Al carried himself with bravado even in chains, his voice firm, his chin raised, his smile practiced for the cameras that waited beyond the doors. To the world he was still the larger-than-life figure who defied the law, who laughed in the face of judgment. To Mary he was still her husband, still the father of her child, though his arrogance pained her even as it impressed the crowd. She did not cheer him as others did, nor did she flinch as his enemies might have hoped. She simply remained still, her silence a veil that neither revealed nor betrayed her inner sorrow. The trial itself unfolded like a play. Lawyers spoke in sharp voices, witnesses shifted uncomfortably, the judge presided with sternness that carried no mercy. The charges varied, for Al had woven himself into so many strands of crime that the law reached for whichever thread it could grasp most tightly. Tax evasion, they called it, as though the enormity of his empire could be reduced to numbers on paper. Yet Mary knew, as did all in the room, that it was not only numbers being judged, but a life of choices that had left the city awash in blood and liquor. Mary sat through it all, day after day, her presence steady, her silence intact. Reporters noted her but rarely, remarking only on her composure, on her modesty, on her refusal to offer drama. She did not weep, did not rage, did not plead. Her face remained calm, her eyes lowered, her prayers whispered silently within her heart. She became, in those days, a figure of endurance, not for the world but for herself, for her son, for the vows she had spoken long ago in a quiet church. When the verdicts came, when the rattle of handcuffs grew louder, when Al was led away under the weight of judgment, Mary rose with quiet dignity and walked out behind him. She did not look at the press who crowded near, did not answer their questions, did not offer a single word. Her silence was her shield, her dignity, her only protest. For though her husband's empire crumbled in the eyes of the law, she would not let the world see her falter. At home, the silence was deeper than ever. Sonny asked questions, and she answered with gentleness, telling him only what was necessary, protecting him from the cruelty of detail. She kept the house in order, kept the routines alive, kept her prayers constant. Yet within her heart she felt the weight of absence, pressing harder with each day. The halls seemed larger, emptier, the nights colder. The rattle of handcuffs echoed in her memory whenever she closed her eyes, a sound that marked the turning point of her life as surely as church bells had once marked her wedding day. She visited Al when permitted, traveling to sterile rooms where guards watched every move, where conversations were limited, where even glances were monitored. In those visits she carried herself with composure, her words soft, her loyalty evident though her heart grew heavier each time she left. She brought small tokens, carried letters, offered reassurance. Al spoke often of appeals, of plans, of hopes for release. Mary listened, nodded, smiled faintly, though within her she knew that the tide had turned, that the empire was no longer rising but falling. Still, she did not voice her doubts, for silence remained her truest form of love. In the long nights after such visits, she sat by Sonny's bed and prayed more fervently than ever. She prayed not for Al's empire, not for his name, not for his triumph. She prayed for his soul, that it might find peace. She prayed for her son, that he might grow free of the shadows cast by his father. And she prayed for herself, that her strength might not fail, that her silence might not consume her entirely, that she might endure the days to come. The world outside her walls moved swiftly. The press continued its pounding. The headlines shouted of Capone's fall. The crowds whispered of justice at last. Mary watched it all from a distance, her veil pulled close, her silence guarding her from intrusion. To the world, she was the gangster's wife. To herself, she was only Mary, the girl from Brooklyn who had once walked beneath church bells, who now walked beneath the rattle of handcuffs. And so the sound lingered, metallic and sharp, echoing not only through the halls of the court, but through the corridors of her life. Each clink was a reminder that the man she had bound herself to was no longer free, that her own freedom was bound with his, that silence remained her only shield against a world eager to devour every word. The rattle faded as the guards led him away, but its echo stayed with her, carried in her steps as she left the courtroom, carried in her prayers as she knelt that night, carried in the silence of her house, where only the breathing of her son reminded her that life, however heavy, continued still. The scrape of a guard's key echoed down the corridor, a harsh metallic sound that broke through the stillness like a blade across stone. Mary sat waiting on the wooden bench, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her veil drawn close, her eyes lowered though they did not move from the barred door before her. The air smelled of disinfectant and damp stone, a sharp scent that clung to the walls and settled in the fabric of her dress. Around her, the murmur of other visitors rose and fell, wives, mothers, children, all waiting for a glimpse of men taken from them by judgment, all bearing their own burdens of silence. When at last the door opened, the guard's voice calling names in a tone stripped of warmth. She rose without haste, her steps steady, her breath controlled. She entered the visiting room, where tables were bolted to the floor, where guards stood like statues, where every movement was watched. There, across the table, sat Alphonse, not in the tailored suits he had once favored, but in the coarse clothing of confinement. His shoulders were still broad, his voice still carried weight, yet something in his eyes seemed diminished, as though the walls around him had pressed inward, tightening the light that once radiated from his gaze. Mary greeted him softly, her words few, her tone steady. She did not weep, did not reproach, did not speak of the world outside in detail. She spoke instead of Sonny, of his health, of his lessons, of the small joys that filled his days. She described the way he smiled when she sang, the way he held her hand in sleep, the way he asked after his father. These were the gifts she brought, words of a son's innocence, carried into a place where innocence seemed long forgotten. Al listened, nodding, his expression softening for a moment, though soon it hardened again, pride rising like armor. He spoke of appeals, of lawyers, of influence still to be wielded. He insisted that this was temporary, that he would not be broken, that his name still carried power beyond these walls. Mary listened quietly, offering only a faint smile, though within her heart she knew that time was shifting, that the empire he clung to was already crumbling to dust. The visits were always brief, measured by the ticking of a clock too stern to allow mercy. When the guard's voice signaled the end, Al's words grew hurried, his gestures more insistent. He reached for her hand across the table, and she let him take it, though the steel of his cuffs brushed her skin. His grip was strong, almost desperate, as though holding her could remind him of the world beyond. She squeezed gently in return, her silence carrying more devotion than words could convey. Then the guard's key scraped again, and Al was led away, his figure receding down the corridor, his chains rattling with each step. Mary returned to her bench, to her veil, to her silence. She left the prison with steady steps, the cold air outside striking her face like a revelation, though it brought no relief. She carried with her the scent of the prison, the sound of chains, the image of Al's eyes behind bars. At home, she did not speak of it to Sonny. She told him only that his father loved him, that he was strong, that one day they would be together again. To protect him, she transformed absence into promise, confinement into waiting, despair into hope. For her son's sake, she bore the weight of truth alone. The visits continued, week after week, each one the same and yet heavier than the last. Mary prepared for them as one prepares for a ritual. She dressed in modest garments, gathered her composure, carried with her the small news of home. She sat across from her husband, listened to his bravado, offered her silence as balm. She rose when the time came, walked out, returned to her son. In this cycle she lived, her days marked not by seasons, but by the rhythm of prison visits, her life bound by the scrape of keys and the rattle of chains. Sometimes, in the quiet of night, she thought of what might have been had his path turned another way. She remembered the boy on the Brooklyn stoop, his laughter careless, his cap tilted, his eyes alight with youth. She remembered their hurried vows, their modest beginnings, the fragile joy of Sonny's birth. Could he have been a different man? Could she have been a different woman? These questions drifted through her mind like smoke, unanswered, unanswerable, dissolving into the silence she wrapped around herself like a cloak. The house, though still standing, seemed altered in his absence. The marble floors echoed more loudly, the halls felt longer, the silence heavier. Visitors came less often, their loyalty thinning with the empire's decline. The feasts ceased, the music vanished, the grandeur grew stale. Mary kept the house in order still, though each task felt more like ritual than necessity. She placed flowers in vases, though they withered quickly in the still air. She prepared meals, though the table was half empty. She tended to her son, her devotion undiminished, her prayers unbroken. The scrape of the guard's key haunted her dreams. She heard it in the stillness, in the creak of the house at night, in the clatter of dishes. It became the sound of inevitability, the reminder that her husband's path had narrowed, that her own life was confined though she walked free. She bore it with dignity, with silence, with the endurance that had always been her shield. Yet in her heart the sorrow deepened, as though each turn of the key locked away not only her husband, but a piece of her own life. And so the visits continued, the prison walls unchanged, the guards unyielding, the keys scraping, the chains rattling. Mary sat across the table, her veil drawn close, her silence steady, her devotion unwavering. She carried her son's love into that room, carried it back out again, carried it through the nights when the house was too quiet, too large, too empty. She endured, as she always had, her silence her strength, her faith her only companion. The scrape of the key closed each chapter of her visits, yet it also opened another in her life, one that she had not chosen but would endure. For Mae Coughlin was no queen of empire, no woman of spectacle. She was the keeper of silence, the bearer of devotion, the shadow in which the flame of loyalty burned, however dimly, however briefly, against the darkness of the world. The smell of antiseptic lingered in the air, sharp and sterile, clinging to the walls of the sick room as though it wished to disguise what could not be hidden. Mary moved quietly through that air, her steps measured, her hands steady, though her heart carried the weight of sorrow she dared not name aloud. On the bed lay Alphonse, his body diminished, his face pale beneath the coarse sheets, his once bright eyes clouded with confusion. The empire that had made him a king of the streets could not defend him against the decay that now consumed him from within. The disease, spoken of only in whispers, had burrowed deep, robbing him first of clarity, then of dignity. Mary, who had lived in his shadow for so many years, now became his caretaker, his shield not against enemies, but against the relentless advance of illness. The doctors came and went, their footsteps brisk, their voices low. They spoke in the language of medicine, of progression and prognosis, words that filled the room with inevitability. Mary listened with bowed head, her hands folded tightly before her, her face composed even as her heart sank. They spoke of decline, of the mind unraveling, of the body following. She thanked them softly, walked them to the door, and then returned to the bedside with a calmness that belied the storm within her. She had been silent in the face of wealth, in the face of rumor, in the face of judgment. Now she was silent in the face of death itself. Al's mind wandered. Sometimes he called her name, his voice trembling with recognition, his eyes momentarily clear. At other times he spoke to shadows, muttering to men who were not there, reliving moments of triumph or violence as though they were happening again before him. Mary did not correct him. She sat at his side, holding his hand, speaking softly, smoothing his brow with a damp cloth. She met each fragment of clarity with devotion, each fragment of delusion with patience. She did not flinch when his words turned harsh, when his confusion grew wild. She endured, as she had always endured, her silence a balm for a man whose own voice had once dominated every room. The house around them seemed to shrink into the sick room. The marble floors, the chandeliers, the grand halls, all of it faded into irrelevance against the reality of the bed, the sheets, the fading man who lay upon them. Servants moved quietly, their eyes lowered, their tasks performed without comment. Visitors came less often, and when they did, their voices were hushed, their steps tentative. The grandeur that had once defined the Capone household was gone, replaced by the smell of antiseptic and the shadow of mortality. Mary walked through it all with the dignity of one who has accepted what cannot be changed. Her devotion to Sonny never faltered, though she shielded him as much as she could from the sight of his father's decline. She told him that his father was unwell, that rest was needed, that love could still be given even when strength was gone. She protected him from the harshest truths, from the sight of chains that had turned into sickness, from the sorrow of seeing a once mighty figure reduced to fragility. For Sonny, she remained strong, her voice gentle, her smile steady, though each night when she was alone, she wept quietly into her folded hands. Al's decline was not swift but drawn out, a slow unraveling that stretched across months. Mary measured time not by clocks or calendars, but by the rhythm of his illness. The days when he could speak her name clearly, the days when he could not rise, the nights when fever consumed him, the mornings when he lay still as though waiting for something unseen. She prayed constantly, not for miracles, but for mercy, for peace, for strength to endure. She prayed that his suffering might be eased, that her son might be spared the deepest sorrows, that her own heart might not fail under the weight of her burden. There were moments of tenderness even in the decline. Once, as she sat by his side, he looked at her with clarity, his hand trembling in hers, and whispered words of gratitude. She leaned close to hear, her tears falling silently, though she smiled and nodded, pressing his hand gently. Whether the gratitude was for her care, for her loyalty, for her silence, she did not know. It was enough that he had spoken it, that in his fading mind he still recognized the woman who had stood beside him in shadow all these years. The illness stripped away his power, his bravado, his legend, the man who had commanded armies of men, who had defied law and order, now struggled to lift a cup, to speak a sentence without faltering. Mary saw not the gangster the world knew, but the husband she had married in haste, the boy she had once walked beside in Brooklyn. She saw the frailty beneath the legend, the humanity beneath the notoriety. And though her heart ached with sorrow, she cared for him without hesitation, her devotion unshaken even as the man he had been slipped further into memory. The antiseptic smell never left the room, mingling with the scent of damp linens, of sweat, of the faint sweetness of flowers she placed by the bed in quiet defiance. The shadows lengthened and Mary sat in them, her figure still, her prayers unending. She thought often of the vows she had spoken long ago, vows of loyalty in sickness and in health. She had not imagined then that sickness would take this form, that health would give way to decay so cruelly. Yet she kept those vows as faithfully as she had kept her silence, for they were the last threads that bound her to the life she had lived, to the man she had loved, however flawed. One night, as she sat in the dim light, Al's hand slipped from hers, falling weakly to the sheet. She caught it, held it again, pressed it to her lips. His eyes, clouded and distant, turned briefly toward her, and for a moment she thought she saw the spark of recognition. Then it faded, and he drifted once more into the fog that claimed him more each day. Mary bowed her head, her tears falling silently, her lips moving in prayer. She did not cry out, did not wail, did not break the silence. She endured, as she always had, her strength woven into quiet devotion. The smell of antiseptic lingered still, The shadow of decay pressed heavily upon the room. Outside, the world carried on. Newspapers, sirens, whispers of power and downfall. Inside, Mary kept her vigil, her silence unbroken, her devotion unyielding. She was no queen, no heroine, no legend. She was only a wife, a mother, a woman who had chosen loyalty and found herself bound to a fate larger than she had ever imagined. And now, in the dim light of the sick room, she bore that fate as she had always borne it, in silence, in faith, in love, unspoken but unbroken. The endless rhythm of the tide became the music of her days, waves breaking and retreating against the shore with a constancy that mocked the shifting ground of her own life. Florida was meant to be a retreat, a place of seclusion, where Al might spend his last years away from the roar of the world that once celebrated and condemned him. The mansion by the water stood bright against the sun, its white walls gleaming, its windows open to the sea air. Yet within it the shadows of illness lingered, and Mary moved through its rooms with the same steady silence she had carried in Chicago. The tide rolled on, indifferent, washing the sand smooth each morning only to disturb it again by night. Mary had never imagined herself here, so far from the streets of Brooklyn where her childhood began, so far from the narrow alleys where neighbors greeted one another, where bells tolled and children played. Here there were palms bending in the breeze, gulls crying overhead, the salty air seeping into every corner of the house. She walked along the veranda with Sonny at her side, the boy now grown taller, though still gentle in manner, his health fragile but sustained by her care. Together they watched the sea, its horizon endless, its constancy offering a comfort the world had long denied them. For Sonny, she tried to make this new home a sanctuary, though in truth it felt to her like an exile, a gilded cage placed at the edge of the ocean. Al's illness deepened in this seclusion. Some days he sat outside, the sun upon his face, his eyes half closed as though trying to remember the energy that had once made him larger than life. On other days he remained in bed, confused, his words tangled, his memory slipping like water through a sieve. Mary was at his side through it all, steady, patient, caring for him as one cares for a child. She fed him when his hands shook, soothed him when he raged against the fog of his mind, prayed over him when sleep seemed more final than rest. The grandeur of his past mattered little here. The empire was gone. The newspapers turned their gaze elsewhere, and what remained was only the frailty of a man and the loyalty of the woman who had never left him. The neighbors, distant as they were, sometimes whispered of the Capone family living quietly by the shore, their curiosity piqued by the presence of such a name. Mary ignored them. She kept to herself, her circle narrowed to her son, her husband, her prayers. She visited town only when necessary, walking with modesty, her eyes lowered, her presence neither inviting nor hostile. To those who glimpsed her, she was unremarkable, a quiet woman tending to her family. Few knew the burden she bore, the shadows that followed her, the silence that had become her companion. In the evenings, when the air cooled and the tide pressed against the shore with heavier hands, Mary often sat upon the veranda, her rosary in her lap, her gaze fixed upon the horizon. The sea seemed endless, eternal, yet she felt her own life measured, finite, bound by the needs of her husband and her son. She prayed not for wealth, not for fame, not for deliverance, but for strength, for patience, for peace. She prayed that her son might one day live free of the shadow of the Capone name, that he might walk in the world as his own man, unburdened by the choices of his father. Sonny, sensitive to her moods, often sat beside her in silence, his hand resting upon hers. He did not ask questions, for he had grown accustomed to her quiet ways, to the unspoken language of her devotion. He was her solace, her anchor, the reason she could rise each day and continue. For him, she endured the isolation, the decline, the endless tide that seemed to wash away all else. She knew his path would not be easy, that the world would always remember his father before it remembered him. Yet she hoped that her love, her guidance, her faith would give him strength to carry his own life with dignity. Al, though fading, still had moments when the past returned to him with startling clarity. He would speak suddenly of Chicago, of the men who had followed him, of the victories he had claimed, of the enemies he had crushed. His voice would rise, his hands gesturing, his old bravado flickering like a flame against the wind. Mary listened without interruption, her eyes lowered, her silence absorbing his words as though they were the echoes of another life. When the moment passed, when confusion returned, she soothed him gently, bringing him back to the present, to the sound of the tide, to the care of her hands. The house itself grew quieter with each passing season. The servants moved softly, their tasks reduced, their presence fading into the background. Visitors came rarely, and when they did, they stayed only briefly, their voices hushed, their eyes filled with unease. The empire that had once drawn men in droves was now a ghost, and those who had once depended upon it scattered like leaves before the wind. Mary noticed, but she did not speak of it. She had long known that loyalty in such a world was fragile, that power held friends only so long as it could reward them. Now there was nothing left to reward, and so there were no friends, only silence. The tide continued its endless rhythm, the waves crashing and retreating, as if mocking the impermanence of human ambition. Mary drew strength from it, though at times it also deepened her sorrow. She thought of her own life, of how she had been swept along by a current not of her making, carried from Brooklyn to Chicago, from Chicago to Florida, each step dictated not by her own desires, but by the force of Al's will. And now, at the end of it, she found herself standing upon the shore, watching the waves erase every footprint, every trace of what had once seemed unshakable. Yet even in this she did not despair. She held fast to her silence, to her devotion, to her son. She believed that love, however quiet, however burdened, could outlast empire, could endure beyond the noise of history. In Sonny's laughter, fragile though it was, she heard the promise of life continuing. In her prayers, whispered to the rhythm of the tide, she found the strength to endure another day, another night, another season. And so Mary kept her vigil by the sea, caring for a husband whose mind slipped further into shadow, guiding a son whose future she prayed would be brighter than his father's past. The tide rolled on, endless and indifferent, its rhythm both comfort and lament. She sat upon the veranda, her rosary in hand, her gaze fixed upon the horizon, her silence as steady as the sea itself. The sound of earth falling on a coffin lid was hollow and final, a dull thud that seemed to echo not only in the Florida soil, but in Mary's chest. Each shovelful struck like the tolling of a bell, reminding her that the long years of sickness and silence had reached their end. Alphonse Capone, once the king of Chicago, once the terror of rivals and the fascination of the press, now lay still beneath the ground, his body surrendered to the earth, as all men's must be, no matter how high they had risen in life. Mary stood veiled in black, her hands folded before her, her posture steady though her heart trembled. The murmurs of mourners swirled around her, their voices hushed, their glances darting, but she heard none of it clearly. She heard only the earth, falling, sealing, silencing. The funeral was attended by those who still dared to show themselves, though fewer than there might have been in earlier years. Many who had once crowded his tables, toasted his victories, laughed at his jokes, were absent now, their loyalty having dissolved when power no longer bound them. Those who came did so out of duty, out of memory, or perhaps out of curiosity. They gathered in somber clusters, whispering of the man he had been, of the empire he had built, of the decline they had witnessed. The press lingered at the edges, their pens eager, their eyes sharp, though Mary ignored them all. She stood as she had always stood, silent, invisible yet unyielding, her veil a shield between her sorrow and the gaze of the world. Sonny was at her side, taller now, his features marked by the passage of years, though his gentle manner remained. He looked upon the coffin with solemn eyes, his hand tightening upon his mother's. Mary felt his grip, warm and steady, and knew that in him lay her future, her reason to endure beyond this day. For him she did not weep openly, though within her heart grief rose like a tide. She held herself with dignity, her silence her armor, her loyalty her final gift to the man whose name had bound her life. The priest's words rose above the murmurs, prayers for mercy, for forgiveness, for eternal rest. Mary bowed her head, her lips moving silently with the familiar prayers, though her thoughts drifted elsewhere. She thought of the boy she had first known, laughing on a stoop in Brooklyn. She thought of their hurried vows, spoken in a church where incense still hung in the air. She thought of the nights of wealth, of the parties, of the music and smoke, of the rumors and the whispers. She thought of the prison visits, the scrape of keys, the smell of antiseptic, the slow decline that had turned a legend into a fragile man. All of it seemed to fold upon itself in this moment as the coffin sank into the ground and the earth covered it, one layer at a time. When the last shovel of soil was thrown, when the murmurs quieted, Mary remained still. She did not move until the priest touched her arm gently, guiding her away. The mourners dispersed, their voices returning to ordinary tones, their gazes turning to one another. Some offered her words of sympathy, but she nodded only faintly, her veil concealing her expression. She had no words to give, no speeches to offer. Her grief was not for display, her sorrow not for sharing. It was hers alone, silent, steady, bound to the life she had lived in shadow. The house by the sea grew quieter after that day. Al's presence, once filling it even in illness, was gone, leaving behind a silence heavier than before. The rooms seemed larger, emptier, their grandeur now hollow. Mary walked through them with measured steps, her hand brushing the furniture as though to remind herself that she was still here, that life, however altered, continued. Sonny remained with her, his presence her comfort, his laughter, though rare, her solace. She tended to him with the same devotion as always, pouring her love into his days, her prayers into his nights. In widowhood, Mary did not seek freedom. She did not cast off her veil, did not turn her back on the name that had defined her. She carried it still, quietly, as she had always done, though now it was heavier with memory. She lived not as the widow of a gangster in the world's eyes, but as the wife of the man she had once married, the father of her child, the figure she had cared for until his last breath. History might remember him otherwise, but for Mary, the memory was her own, private, unspoken. The world, of course, moved on. Newspapers printed their obituaries, their judgments, their reflections. Some called him a villain, some a folk hero, all eager to reduce a life to words on a page. Mary did not read them. She had no need to see her husband turned into a figure for strangers to debate. She knew the truth of him, both the hardness and the tenderness, the power and the fragility. She carried that truth within her, in silence, as she always had. At night she sat once more upon the veranda, the tide still rolling, the horizon still endless. The stars shimmered above the dark sea, their light steady, though faint. She held her rosary in her hands, her prayers soft, her tears falling unseen. She prayed not only for Al's soul, but for her son's future, for her own strength, for the grace to endure the years ahead. She prayed for peace, though she knew it was a peace that might come only in the quiet of her own heart. The sound of earth upon the coffin lingered in her memory, dull and final, yet also strangely merciful. It had marked the end of his suffering, the end of her long vigil as caretaker, the end of a chapter that had bound her life for decades. Now, in its echo, she found herself beginning another chapter, though it was not of her choosing. She was a widow, bound by memory, bound by silence, bound by love that had endured through shadows. And so she lived, quietly, in the house by the sea, her days marked by prayer, her nights by the rhythm of the tide. She carried her grief as she had carried everything else, in silence, in faith, in devotion unspoken but unbroken. The world might forget her, might speak only of the man she had stood beside, but within her own heart she knew that her story, too, was worth remembering, even if it was written only in silence. The ticking of a small clock on the mantel filled the room, each sound distinct in the silence, each tick a measure of time passing with quiet insistence. Mary sat near the clock, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze turned toward the window where the afternoon light slanted across the floor in pale bands. The years after Al's burial had not brought freedom nor release, but rather a deepening stillness, a life reduced to its simplest elements. No more guests crowded the rooms, no more feasts filled the air with smoke and laughter, no more footsteps echoed with the urgency of ambition. The house in Florida became a place of obscurity, a refuge perhaps, but also a retreat into invisibility. Mary lived there with Sonny, her son now grown into a man, though still gentle and vulnerable, still carrying the frailty that had marked his life since childhood. The days unfolded quietly, marked by small routines that gave structure to existence. Mary rose early as she always had, her movements measured, her prayers whispered in the dim light before dawn. She prepared meals with care, not for grandeur but for nourishment, her hands steady in their familiar tasks. She tended to the rooms, keeping them clean, though the house seemed too large for two souls, its silence vast, its grandeur hollow. She tended also to her son, who remained her central devotion, her reason for bearing the weight of years. Sonny's health was still delicate, his hearing still limited, and Mary's patience never wavered. She guided him with kindness, protected him from the harsher edges of the world, and reminded him daily of the dignity that could be carried even in silence. Visitors came rarely. The world had moved on, its attention fixed upon new figures, new scandals, new empires. The name Capone remained known, but it was spoken more as legend than as present reality. Reporters occasionally sought her out, eager for a glimpse of the widow, for a word that might feed their stories. Mary gave them nothing. She remained veiled in her silence, refusing to betray her privacy, refusing to let her life be turned into spectacle. She had spent too many years as a shadow to step into the glare now. Her refusal was not born of bitterness, but of resolve, the same quiet strength that had carried her through all that had come before. Sonny lived with her, his presence her comfort, his dependence her burden, though she never saw it as such. He was her anchor, the one true gift of her life, the embodiment of love that had endured despite all shadows. Together they lived simply, their days bound by routines, their nights by prayer. Mary found solace in the small moments, in the way her son smiled when she read to him, in the way he walked beside her along the shore, in the sound of his breathing at night. These moments, small to others, were treasures to her, reminders that life, however quiet, still held meaning. At times in the stillness she thought of the past. Memories rose unbidden, the sound of laughter in grand halls, the shimmer of gowns, the music that once filled their home. She thought of Brooklyn, of narrow streets and church bells, of her mother's hands kneading bread. She thought of Al, of the boy on the stoop, of the man in chains, of the patient she had cared for until the end. These memories came like waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes sharp, yet always fading back into the sea of silence that surrounded her. She did not dwell upon them. She let them come and go, as inevitable as the tide. The clock ticked on, marking hours that seemed both endless and fleeting. Mary often sat near it, listening to its rhythm, finding in it a strange companionship. It reminded her that time continued, that life did not stop even in obscurity, that each moment carried weight whether the world noticed or not. She had lived through notoriety, through grandeur, through judgment. Now she lived through silence, and perhaps that was the truest test of all. Her faith remained her constant. Each day she prayed, her rosary worn smooth by years of use, her words whispered into the quiet. She prayed for her husband's soul, for her son's life, for her own endurance. She prayed also for forgiveness, though she was never certain for what, for the silence she had kept, for the loyalty she had given, for the doubts she had harbored. Her prayers were not for answers, but for peace, a peace that might settle in her heart even as the world beyond her walls remained restless. The seasons passed gently in Florida, the air warm, the sea constant. Mary rarely traveled, rarely sought the world beyond her home. She had no need for it. Her life was contained within these walls, within her son's company, within her prayers. The grandeur of the past no longer tempted her. The silence of the present was enough. She did not measure her worth by wealth or fame, but by endurance, by devotion, by the quiet dignity that had carried her through all storms. Sometimes she sat by the window at dusk, watching the sky darken, the first stars appearing above the sea. The house was quiet, the only sound the ticking of the clock, steady as breath. She thought then of how the world would remember her husband, of how history would speak his name while forgetting hers. She did not resent it. She knew her life had been lived in shadow, and she had accepted that long ago. What mattered to her was not remembrance by strangers, but the love she carried for her son, the faith she carried for herself, the silence she carried as both burden and shield. The clock ticked on, marking each moment with quiet insistence, and Mary sat beside it, her figure steady, her heart calm. The world outside might forget her, but within her home, within her prayers, within the quiet company of her son, she endured. Her life was not spectacle, not legend, but devotion, and in that devotion lay a strength greater than any empire, a strength that would carry her until the final silence came. An unanswered question hung in the air, weightless yet heavy, as if it had been whispered not by a voice but by the silence itself. Had her silence been her shield, or had it been her prison? Mary sat with this question in the stillness of her later years, turning it over in her mind without expectation of answer. Silence had been her constant companion, as loyal as any friend, as faithful as any vow. It had preserved her dignity. It had kept her safe from words she could not take back. It had protected her son from truths too cruel for his tender heart. Yet silence had also kept her unseen, erased her from the story even as she lived within it, bound her to shadows so deeply that history itself would forget her name while speaking endlessly of her husband's. She wondered, as the tide whispered against the shore beyond her windows, whether silence had preserved her life or consumed it. She remembered moments when she might have spoken, when rumors of Al's infidelities reached her ears, when whispers of violence filled the halls, when the rattle of handcuffs first echoed in the courtroom, when the smell of antiseptic clung to his sick room. In each of these moments, words had risen in her throat, questions, accusations, protests, but she had swallowed them, letting silence take their place. Was that strength, or was it surrender? She could not say. Perhaps it was both, for in truth, strength and surrender often share the same face, and only memory decides which name to give. She thought of the women she had known in those years, the wives who had laughed too loudly, who had whispered too freely, who had sometimes dared to speak. Some had paid dearly for their words, abandoned, betrayed, dismissed by husbands who valued obedience more than honesty. Mary had seen their fates, had learned from their examples. Silence, she believed, had spared her such ruin. Yet silence had also kept her hidden, reduced to a figure glimpsed in photographs, unnamed in headlines, forgotten in the stories that followed. She wondered if she had become a shadow willingly, or if the shadow had consumed her before she ever realized she had stepped into it. At night, when the house was quiet and Sunny slept, Mary often sat by the window, the rosary in her hand, the sea stretching endlessly before her. The stars shimmered above, indifferent, ancient, their light reaching her across distances she could not fathom. In their light, she felt the weight of her own invisibility. The world would remember Al, would debate his deeds, would turn his name into legend or curse, but her own life, her own choices, her own endurance would fade into silence as surely as a breath fades into the air. Did it matter? Perhaps not to history, but perhaps to God, and perhaps that was enough. Her silence was not without meaning. She knew that. It had been the language of her devotion, the vessel of her endurance, the shield for her son, yet it was also the mark of her erasure, the reason her story would remain untold. In this paradox she lived, both strong and forgotten, both enduring and unseen. The question lingered. Was it worth it? She did not know. She did not expect to know, not in this life. Sometimes she imagined another path, one where she had spoken, where she had confronted, where she had demanded loyalty in return for loyalty, truth in return for silence. Would Al have listened? Would anything have changed? She doubted it. He was a man consumed by ambition, by power, by the noise of the world. Her words would have been drops in a storm, washed away before they could take root. Perhaps silence had been the only path after all. Perhaps it was not choice, but destiny. And yet, the question remained, was she free in her silence, or was she imprisoned by it? The answer shifted with the tides, sometimes one, sometimes the other, never settling, never clear. She prayed for clarity, but clarity did not come. Instead, she prayed for peace, for acceptance, for the grace to let the question remain unanswered. For not all questions find their answers in life. Some remain mysteries, carried into the grave with those who bore them. Sunny, her son, never questioned her silence. To him, she was simply his mother, steadfast, patient, enduring. He did not know the words she had swallowed, the tears she had hidden, the doubts she had buried. He knew only the love she had given, the devotion she had carried. In his eyes, perhaps, silence had not been erasure but strength, not prison but sacrifice. In his eyes, she had been enough. That thought comforted her, though it did not resolve the question fully. The sea whispered against the shore, the stars shimmered above, the clock ticked on. Mary sat with her unanswered question, her rosary warm in her hands, her prayers soft upon her lips. Perhaps silence was both shield and prison, both strength and surrender, both devotion and erasure. Perhaps it was not one thing, but many, shifting with each season of her life, changing its face as she changed hers. Perhaps the truth was not in choosing, but in accepting that both could be true. And so she let the question linger, unresolved, unbroken, as part of her story. For Mae Coughlin was not a woman of answers, but of endurance, not a woman of spectacle, but of silence. Her life was lived not in declarations, but in quiet acts of loyalty, in devotion unseen, in strength that history would overlook. The question remained, like the tide, like the stars, like the ticking clock, a rhythm without conclusion, a mystery without resolution. And as she sat in the stillness, her unanswered question drifted upward like a prayer, carried into the night where only silence responded. The soft lamp was extinguished with a gentle twist of Mary's hand, and the room fell into shadow, leaving only the faint glow of the moon through the thin curtains. That small act, the quiet fading of light, seemed to mirror what was happening beyond her walls, the slow dimming of her presence in the memory of the world. Outside, the name of Al Capone endured, spoken in stories, printed in books, whispered in bars, debated in parlors. His legend lived on, sharpened by retelling, burnished by rumor, transformed into something greater and darker than the man himself had ever been. But Mary, who had stood beside him in silence for decades, faded from recollection. The world did not seek her story. It did not ask what strength she had carried, what burdens she had borne, what life she had lived in the shadow of another. Her silence, once her shield, now ensured her forgetting. She felt it in the way newspapers wrote of him long after his death, recounting the empire, the crimes, the downfall. They rarely mentioned the wife who had endured beside him, and when they did, it was as a footnote, a shadow, a quiet figure without voice. She had known this would be her fate, perhaps, for she had chosen invisibility. Yet now, in the stillness of her later years, she wondered what it meant to be forgotten, while another's memory swelled into legend. Was it mercy, to slip away unnoticed, or was it another form of erasure, one final silence imposed upon her? Her days passed quietly, each one much like the last. She moved through her home with deliberate care, tending to her son, keeping her prayers, watching the sea. Visitors were few, and those who came spoke of the past as though it belonged entirely to Al, as though she had never been part of it. She listened politely, nodded faintly, and returned to her silence. They did not ask her what she remembered, and she did not offer it. In their eyes, she was not history's witness, but merely its shadow. Sonny, devoted as always, kept her company. He spoke with her gently, smiled often, and treated her with the reverence of a son who understood how much he owed to her care. To him, she was not forgotten. To him, she was the center of his world. In his presence she found comfort. In his love she found validation that her life had not been in vain. Yet she knew that beyond their small household, her existence was fading, her name dissolving into obscurity, even as his father's name grew larger with time. Sometimes at night, she lit a lamp again and sat with the old photographs, images of Al in his youth, standing tall, his cap tilted, his smile bold, images of parties, of gatherings, of faces long gone. Rarely was she in the photographs herself. Even in images, she had remained at the edge, unseen, her presence implied rather than captured. She studied those photographs with quiet resignation, knowing that history would remember them, not her, knowing that her own face would fade like the lamplight, leaving only shadow behind. And yet, in her heart, she knew that forgetting was not the whole truth. For though the world might overlook her, though books and stories might erase her, the love she had given, the strength she had carried, the silence she had borne, these were not erased. They lived on in her son, in the life she had preserved for him, in the prayers she had offered faithfully each night. They lived on, perhaps unseen, but no less real. History might not carry her name, but eternity, she believed, carried her soul, and in that she found her peace. Still, she could not help but feel the sorrow of vanishing. To be forgotten while another is remembered so loudly is its own kind of grief. The lamp extinguished, the room darkened, the silence pressed heavily, and she felt herself fading even as she breathed. Yet perhaps this was fitting. She had lived in silence. Why should her memory not rest in silence too? Perhaps in the quiet of obscurity she could find the peace denied to those who lived in legend. Perhaps to be forgotten was to be free. Outside, the city still spoke of Al, still passed along stories of his empire, still turned his life into myth. Children who had never seen his face learned his name in whispers. Writers turned him into symbol. The world would never let him rest. Mary, by contrast, slipped quietly from view. The sea carried away her days like the tide sweeping sand. The lamp went dark, and no one noticed. Only Sonny knew. Only Sonny cared. Only Sonny remembered the devotion, the prayers, the endurance. For him, she was never shadow. For him, she was light. She sat again by the window, her rosary warm in her hands, her gaze turned toward the horizon. The sea moved endlessly, as it always had, its rhythm steady, its silence deeper than words. She thought of the lamp she had extinguished, of the light that had faded, of the shadow that remained. She thought of herself as that lamp, quiet, steady, unnoticed, yet still burning faithfully until the moment it went out. And perhaps, she thought, there is dignity in that. Not all lights are meant to dazzle. Some are meant only to keep one small corner warm, one small life safe, one small soul comforted. That had been her role, and she had fulfilled it. The lamp remained dark, the room shadowed, the sea whispering outside. Mary sat in her silence, unremembered by the world but held still in the love of her son, in the memory of her devotion, in the grace of her faith. And if the world forgot her, then let it. For she knew that in the heart of eternity, nothing given in love is ever truly lost. The breath of silence itself seemed to fill the room, softer than the sea wind, lighter than a sigh, as Mary sat in her final years, her gaze turned inward more often than outward. Time had grown slow around her, each day resembling the last, yet within that slowness she found a peculiar clarity. She no longer measured life by clocks or calendars, but by the rhythm of her own prayers, by the rise and fall of her son's voice, by the faint stirring of the tide beyond her windows. The world outside had long since moved on, leaving her behind like a shadow at dusk, and yet she remained, faithful to her routines, faithful to her silence, faithful to the life she had lived in the shadow of another's legend. Her body grew frailer, her steps slower, her hands more delicate, yet her composure never faltered. She dressed simply, kept her home neat, tended to Sonny with unwavering devotion. She accepted age as she had accepted everything else, with calm, with silence, with faith. The grandeur of her husband's empire was long gone. Its echoes faded, its memory turned into myth for strangers to debate. But in her heart, what endured was not the empire, but the ordinary. The sound of Sonny's laughter as a child, the warmth of a hand once clasped in marriage, the prayers whispered night after night. These were the treasures she carried into her final days, unseen but unforgotten. She reflected often, though quietly, upon the path her life had taken. From the narrow streets of Brooklyn to the marble halls of Chicago, from the sick room to the shoreline of Florida, she had walked always in silence, bearing burdens unseen by the world. Was it a wasted life? The question hovered like a shadow, but she did not dwell upon it. For her, life was not measured in notoriety or remembrance, but in devotion. She had given herself fully, to her husband, to her son, to her faith, and though history would not record it, she knew it was not nothing. It was her truth, her offering, her quiet form of strength. Sonny remained her closest companion, her comfort in those years of obscurity. He had grown into a man, yet his dependence upon her had never ceased, and she accepted it as blessing rather than burden. Together they lived quietly, walking along the shore, sitting side by side in the evenings, sharing small joys that bound them together. For him she continued, even as her strength waned. For him she prayed that he might one day be free of shadows, though she knew the name he carried would never release him fully. Still, she believed that love itself was stronger than any name, and in that belief she found peace. At night, when sleep was slow to come, Mary sometimes thought of Al, not the legend, not the figure etched into newspapers, but the man she had known in moments unseen by the world, the boy on the stoop, the husband who once held her hand with tenderness, the father who lifted Sonny with laughter, the patient who whispered gratitude even as illness consumed him. She remembered him not as history would, but as she had lived beside him, in fragments of humanity, in fleeting tenderness, in moments of fragility, Whatever the world said of him, she knew her own truth, and she carried it silently into her prayers. The sea remained her constant, its rhythm endless, its voice steady. She listened to it as one listens to a hymn, finding in it both lament and comfort. The tide erased footprints as quickly as it revealed them, reminding her that all lives, no matter how large, are eventually washed into memory. Perhaps her silence, her obscurity, was not erasure but alignment with this truth. Perhaps to fade quietly was the most natural end of all. She let the thought rest within her, neither bitter nor resigned, but accepted as part of the mystery of life. As her strength waned, she prayed more often, her rosary warm in her hands, her voice soft, her words almost indistinguishable from breath. She prayed for forgiveness, for peace, for reunion with those she had loved. She prayed not to be remembered by the world, but to be known by God, whose memory, she believed, held all things, even the smallest acts of devotion, even the quietest lives. She trusted that in that eternal remembrance, nothing of her would be lost, no matter how deeply the world forgot her. One evening, as the lamp flickered low and Sunny sat quietly by her side, Mary closed her eyes and let the silence surround her. She felt the breath of the sea through the open window, smelled the faint salt of the tide, heard the ticking of the clock on the mantel. She thought of her life as a thread woven through shadows, unnoticed by many, yet strong enough to endure all storms. She thought of herself not as legend, not as queen, but as a flame that had burned quietly, faithfully, until the end. The breath of silence deepened, filling the room, settling upon her like a benediction. She did not resist it. She let it embrace her, as she had embraced silence all her life. And in that final stillness, her story remained what it had always been, unresolved, unspoken, carried like the tide into mystery. The lamp went out, the sea whispered on, the silence endured.